Now, we have to talk here about the idea of the so-called good war. And I want to talk about this with you via the concept of friendship. Many of us will say, okay, I agree. Clearly we know enough now to say with some certainty that the Iraq War was a joke. But surely that doesn't mean that all wars are bad, right? What about World War II, for example? Surely that, at least that, the defeat of Hitler, the defeat of the Nazis, was a noble war. Weren't we on the right side there? And of course, the argument here is very much akin to the argument that we discussed weeks ago when in the media class we discussed the movie Saving Private Ryan. That was in week 7, which Steven Spielberg, who made the movie, had sort of said that it was an anti-war film in the sense that he recognized war was ugly and put us through horrible experiences. But of course, he said at the end of the day that didn't mean that just because war is horrible, that and in a sense we should always be anti-war, that war wasn't necessary, right? So Steven Spielberg, of course, supports World War II. And it's an interesting way to start a conversation about, changing the world, thinking about the good war. Because as your author for this week in the concluding chapter of the textbook, Maya Zafus, argues, there are at least 2 dilemmas that confront us when we think about the moral utility of war. The first is one that I would contend, although Zafus doesn't mention this, that's fine though, but I would contend was originally conceived of by Clausewitz, who is the Prussian general we talked about in our class last week on security. Clausewitz, the Prussian general, who tried to sort of turn the study of military discipline into an academic study, to apply modern Newtonian physics and the study of chemistry to the study of war, and see what metaphors and concepts could be joined between the two. Because, of course, war is really about force projection, and that has a science to it. So, but one of the things that Clausewitz noted, even as he tried to elaborate this science of war, is that politics always gets in the way of war, right? So in that sense, no one ever really fights a pure war. If you were to fight a pure war, you'd obliterate your enemy, right? But of course we have in our general lives and also in times of war obligations. Even the most tyrannical dictator has to a certain extent, act morally. He cannot extract everything from his own population to fight a war. He has to keep the people at home, intact, keep them in some sort of standard of living. So there's always a limit to war, right? We don't ever fight a full-on, full-tilt war, right? And that's because we can't fight a pure war and satisfy our other moral obligations at the same time. So sacrifices have to be made. We always find a trade-off, a middle ground position between the two. So we either don't fight the best war or we don't satisfy our obligations to the other human beings around us, whether they be the enemy or our own people. And so most wars are fought somewhere in this middle ground between the two pressures, or the two goals, if you will, that come to bear on us in times of war. So that's dilemma 1, right? The idea of not really ever being able to use war to the full extent. If war is a tool, Clausewitz always said that war is politics carried out by other means. And I think you get to see the point, right? If war is politics by other means, then politics is the limit of war, interestingly enough. So the second point then is about uncertainty. And we spoke just last week about Rumsfeld talking about the known knowns, the known unknowns, the unknown unknowns. And Rumsfeld, of course, was George W. Bush's Secretary of Defense, and he was talking about the complexity of thinking about security in times of globalization. And I said to you then, and I repeat it now, that the kind of underlying metaphor for a lot of this talk is cancer, right? Because if globalization can be thought of as networks of open flows, the openness of our lives in globalization makes us vulnerable to dangers that we can't really anticipate. Just like our bodies are founded on open networks of information, we call it DNA, right? Our bodies are composed of DNA, and DNA can be corrupted by innumerable factors, and we don't really know whatever causes our cancer exactly. We know what can contribute to it. So smoking can promote lung cancer, for example. But a lot of people who get lung cancer have never smoked a day in their lives. So it's a kind of a slippery slope argument. You know, you have to ask yourself certain questions. How far do you want to go to achieve security before you end up actually living a life that's unworthy of the name, right? Do you want to live a life of paranoia about your security, or a life that's worth living? and so that's the sort of that idea of uncertainty is the other dilemma then. So, you know, never really being able to fight a pure war, the moral utility of war when it's always linked to politics, or admitting at least that there's always a kind of a moral utility to war. It's not just that war is useful, but war is linked to our notions of morality, inevitably. And then obviously this other question about uncertainty. So there's a tug of war here between these two things, right? The idea of uncertainty, the need for vigilance, and also the idea that we are restrained in terms of what we can do in war. And when we decide to go to war, we are up against those two dilemmas. And of course, in 2003, we went to war anyway and decided, as we do in times of war, because this is what war is, we put some in harm's way in order to achieve protection of others. And in the 2003 war, we put the lives of US soldiers and Iraqi civilians in harm's way, it is alleged, to protect us from WMDs. And famously, people like Dick Cheney, Donald Rumsfeld, Condoleezza Rice, all these well-known names from the George W. Bush administration, all said in various interviews on Sunday morning talk shows, etc., that while we can't be 100% certain about WMDs, we can be reasonably certain, and we cannot wait, by the way, until the final confirmation comes in the shape of a mushroom cloud. So it's the probability of certainty, and the idea that if you waited for total certainty, that would be too late, right? Because it would be the shape of a WMD, right? Like it would be a dirty bomb or a nuclear bomb going off in an American city or something. So the trade-off there of the sort of ticking time bomb, if you will, we discussed that way ago in our class on torture. The ticking time bomb scenario was, of course, the background idea for a lot of this. So the implicit argument is that we must put some in harm's way now, or others will be put in harm's way later. We must do wrong now to avert potentially some greater wrong that may come later. And of course, you know, it doesn't take a rocket scientist to see that those we sought to protect really were Western people, right? So there's a moral hierarchy here of an us and them. The Western lives in the future, potential future victims of WMD, were considered more valuable than the 200,000 lives of Iraqi non-combatants and civilians that died as a result of shock and awe and other factors, all unleashed by the Iraq War. So we have to ask ourselves a question here, you know, like, how would we feel if someone turned that logic around on us? What if the Soviet Union or something had invaded us to protect and kill 200,000 Americans, or took out an American city or something in order to protect Russian lives down the road, right? I don't know that we would accept the logic so easily if it was turned around on us. But also, interestingly, the lives of these future Western victims potentially were deemed more valuable than the lives of our own soldiers. And although we would grieve for those lives, we grieve for our fallen soldiers because they are part of the Western world whose values we're seeking to protect. But we do that even as we know that their lives are expendable in order to complete this mission. So we've spoken in the past of various ways of figuring out how these kinds of philosophies work. We talked about Beitz and Walzer back in the class about the ticking time bomb scenario and about thinking about who we are as global political citizens. And they never, as we said, really gave us a complete answer. One made the general argument that we were part of a meaning-making community, and as such we should always prioritize that. Then you had, and that was Walzer. Then Bites puts forward this idea that no, we're part of a global humanity. Well, both really could be deployed in defense of the Iraq War, right? So that disagreement of doing something for America or doing something for global humanity, you saw both sides. The left liberals who supported the war and the neoconservatives who supported the war were making both of those arguments, and both of them led the same direction. Both of them led to the war. They were trying to, again, change the world to make it a better place. But both unashamedly and unreservedly making those arguments with a view to sacrificing certain lives to protect others. And this is what leads us to thinking about the philosopher here in the screen, Jacques Derrida, and his concept of the Aporia. Laura Bush, the wife of President George W. Bush, the First Lady of the United States, argued at the start of the invasion of Afghanistan that there was a strong feminist argument for invading Afghanistan, and it was because of the way women were treated by the Taliban. And one thing that I think we need to recognize, again, is the sort of way that argument made the lives of the Taliban sacrificable, right? They were the ones, and I'm not saying we need to somehow agree with the way the Taliban were treating women or something, but just to sort of recognize that once we make somebody's life expendable in a war, we are effectively kind of closing our ears to the particularity of their story, their motivation, and indeed, of course, also the many, many civilians who weren't Taliban who would be killed in that war, many of whom would, of course, be women. And this is the kind of puzzle, then, what Jacques Derrida called an aporia. There's a beautiful quote I'm going to put on the screen for you here. This is Derrida's question, which is, what is friendship? And isn't it the case that friendship itself, forget about war for a minute, but just look at friendship. How can we be friends with someone without sacrificing, in a sense, someone else? Here's the quote: as soon as I enter into a relationship with the other, with the gaze, look, request, love, command, or call of the other, I know that I can respond only by sacrificing ethics. That is, by sacrificing whatever obliges me also to respond in the same way, in the same instant, to all the others, right? So what Derrida is sort of putting on the table here is this idea that even in friendship, you can kind of see friendship as unethical. It sounds bonkers, I know, but if you think about it, a friend is a privileged other among an ocean of potential others. And our countrymen, if we are Walzer, if we go back to our thoughts about Walzer, or if we go back to our thoughts about Bites, again, this is start of the semester, this was all in our module on torture, our global humanity for Bites, then who is the enemy for Bites? It's the non-friend, right? It's the person who's trying to undermine the security or integrity of global humanity, right? So this is what Derrida calls an aporia, right? A logical inconsistency or a logical gap where we cannot really think through how to create a perfect theory. So we settle for the second best theory, right? And what Derrida would have us to recognize is that why we might think Walzer or Bites or whomever, the neocons, the liberals, may have a perfect theory, that they have a perfect argument or a perfect piece of information that can help us, finally settle this matter about, whether war is right or this or that war is right or wrong. We never really get that, right? And we always find ourselves disappointed. So, for example, here's a good provocation. Had there actually been WMD in Iraq, would that have made it worth it? Would the war have therefore suddenly become a good war if Saddam Hussein actually had a nuclear bomb? It's a good question, because, if Saddam Hussein actually had a bomb, it's an open question whether he would ever have actually used it. Think about the countries that do have the nuclear bomb today. They're not all, covered in glory as democracies and whatever, right? I mean, admittedly, France, UK, United States, Western countries, Russia have nuclear bombs, but so does Israel, Pakistan, India. They have a lot of them, So, in a sense, at least in the context of India and Pakistan, one could argue that WMDs, the possession of WMDs, has made these countries less warlike towards each other. Maybe Iraq, by having the bomb, would have pacified. Look at North Korea. North Korea now has the bomb, and countries. You don't have to agree with me on this, but it seems America is being a lot more respectful towards North Korea lately under the Trump administration than it has for the previous 50 years since the Korean War. So having a bomb doesn't necessarily mean that the country is a psycho country and going to use the bomb, right? Most countries are not suicidal, and if Iraq had a nuclear bomb and never actually used it, according to a realist perspective, that would be the day that Iraq would get turned into a parking lot, because we'd surely nuke it back in revenge or in exchange, right? So Iraq would know that. And so there's a kind of a paradox about having a nuclear bomb in some ways. Now, you don't agree with me on that. That's just a sort of an argument that I'm interested in exploring. Yet we freaked out about the idea of Iraq having a nuclear bomb or a dirty bomb or a WMD of some sort, just as we freak out today about the idea of Iran having a nuclear bomb, even though Iran likely won't have a nuclear bomb for a long, long time. It's the very sort of hypothesis, a hypothetical of an Iranian nuclear bomb that freaks us out. Is Iran a suicidal country? Well, if North Korea isn't, then I don't see how Iran would be. So, we said the same thing about the Soviet Union a long time ago, that it was a suicidal country. It wasn't. And anyway, so the upshot then, I suppose, to kind of, and this is, I think, where our author this week makes a very strong point. Moral decisions are not made with perfect information, right? We don't have the perfect theory. We might say, had Iraq had a bomb, that would have been the clincher, the perfect bit of information that would have made the war a moral war. But that's never going to happen, right? We're never going to have a decision to go to war that's based on perfect information, perfect knowledge. The decision to go to war is not like a mathematical equation or a pure calculation. There's always emotions involved. We feel friendship for certain people, enmity for others. Emotions are certainly involved. Instincts, proclivities are involved. And that's, I think, sometimes while we can feel a hard decision more in our hearts than in our heads. Hard decisions, no matter what they are, something in our personal lives or something that our country confronts, are hard for that reason, right? And this brings us, of course, to someone we've talked about when we talked about our class on nations, and that's Nietzsche. The idea of the eternal return. We talked during that day about the novel from Milan Kundera, The Unbearable Lightness of Being. It's very relevant here because in the opening essay for that novel, Kundera argues that we don't get to live our lives eternally, right? Or rather, we don't get to live our lives infinitely and live our life over and over and over again to try to get it right. We only get one life, and it's not a dress rehearsal. If we got to live our life 1,000 times, 2,000, 10,000 times over, we could perfect it, kind of like the movie Groundhog Day. He got to do his day over and over and over again and find out the right way to live his day to get time moving on again. Very, very interesting. So Nietzsche argues that this is the kind of notion of the eternal return. And of course, it doesn't really exist for us. It's not something we get to do. And that's Nietzsche's point. We only get the now. And we're caught up in the imperfection of our knowledge. We can't wait to act. We have to keep all the options on the table, and for this reason we can never make a 100% correct decision. We want to keep all the options on the table, but of course as time goes by the options diminish, right? And eventually we're left with little or no option. History sort of visits us if we don't visit it first. So that's the human condition, the idea of being forced to act. Now, on this next slide, we're getting kind of close to the end here, guys. We have Leonardo da Vinci's famous sketch, the Vitruvian Man, from the 15th century, named after the ancient Roman architect Vitruvius, who believed that there was a way of representing a human being perfectly, perfect mathematical form, describing the proportions of mankind, in his essence, that would allow, whether it would be art or in architecture, for a perfect consideration of the human form. So think about this for a minute, right? This is something that we've talked about at length before, the moment in history where science becomes ascendant and we decide that human beings have a better chance of governing themselves, regulating themselves, orienting their own politics themselves, without religion, without God. We separate church and state, and we put science in as the new God, so to speak. So this is really, I think, strongly encapsulated in Leonardo da Vinci's painting here, this idea of man as a sort of a form that can be represented. And this is important to reflect on. What do we mean by man here? Man not as the creature or being bearing a spiritual or metaphysical nature, but man that has a natural nature, and a nature that is from nature, which of course can be known in the way that we try to know nature. We try to know gravity, we try to know cells in a plant, we try to know the orbits of the planets, split the atom, etc. In this sense, we can also say that we can know man. And so we're going to know man not on God's terms, which is what we'd been doing before the separation of church and state, but on man's terms. We can say this is then an immanent knowledge, a knowledge that's immanent to man, or within man, via, of course, science. So we've looked at a lot of these issues this semester, and the way in which our desire to change the world based on knowledge, scientific knowledge or otherwise, requires that we sort of understand our own involvement in politics. In Module 1, if we go back to Module 1, we looked at the thinking of Cox, Robert Cox, who pointed out as a theorist that the world is not fixed, the world is always flowing, and it cannot be known from one standpoint as such, right? Because we're only catching one part of the motion from where we're standing, and the minute that we've caught the representation of it, it's moved on again. It's like the stream. And that's very similar, as we've argued before, to the idea of quantum mechanics, where observation changes things. The minute we say what is, the minute we describe a thing, the thing has moved on. And so our representation is kind of freezing in static form, just as Leonardo da Vinci's image here is doing. Freezing in static form the nature of a thing from a single point of view, because of course this is not what man looks like, right? There's shorter men, taller men, fatter men, thinner men. Man does not have a perfect arm leg ratio. Some people have longer arms, longer torsos, shorter legs, bigger faces. This is a white man, not a black man, not a Hispanic man, etc., right? So there's just many different ways in which we can say that Da Vinci here is a symptom with his representation of man, Da Vinci's artwork here is a symptom of a modern way of thinking about man, a modern scientific way of thinking about man, which of course is completely destroyed by the arrival in our recent history of principles of quantum mechanics and relativism. So we can say our representation is what is, but of course our truth from these representations is really not truth at all. It's just representation. And it's important to recognize that. We may therefore try to solve the world's problems. As Cox calls it, we may engage in problem-solving theory, but we are advised by Cox to remember that the world we're changing is just the world from our point of view. It's not the world as it is, because that is infinitely complex and cannot be known. Module 6, we talked about the way we act in the name of authority frequently. We call on others to act as well, in the name of truth, in the name of scientific truth, in the name of science, scientific truth. And Stanley Milgram, who carried out the electroshock experiments in Stanford, showed us how, in the name of that truth, it wasn't just the Japanese or the Nazis who had this unquestioning obedience to authority. He got ordinary people in off the street to participate in experiments with an actor hooked up to an electric chair, and they would ask the actor questions. And if the actor would get the questions wrong, the person from right off the street would apply an electric shock. And if you remember from the class, the surprising thing Milgram found out was that so many people are going to apply lethal or very harmful amounts of electricity to someone in that situation because someone with a clipboard and a name tag had told them to do so, in the name of science, and had also helped them sign a waiver that they were not legally responsible for what would happen next, just like a soldier can say he's following the chain of command and is not legally responsible for carrying out the orders from his superior. Then in Module 13, we talked about the move to financialization and how that move to financialization has arguably happened only as capitalism itself has entered into a terrible crisis where since the 1970s it really hasn't been able to provide meaningful wages for working class people, and working class people have had to work more and more hours in order to have middle class existence and go into debt at the same time. And in this sense then, we talked about financialization as based on an unproductive economy, in other words, based on speculation on speculation on speculation. It becomes similar to what we've called before a Ponzi scheme. And this Ponzi scheme comes at great costs in terms of our everyday life, because the bubbles that inevitably emerge in financialization do burst, and when they burst, they hurt people. We have credit crunches, people lose their jobs, people are no longer able to pay, as a result of losing their jobs, their mortgages. And we are then, I think, confronted with the idea that we're kind of living in an economy that's based on emotions and speculation as opposed to actual factories where actual production was going on. Now, of course, we had financial crises in times when there were factories, and factories were the main way we produce value in our society as well. So that's certainly not to say that that version of capitalism was all that much better, but it seems that our financialized capitalism, the one we're living in today, is really susceptible in a dramatic sense to very serious types of financial collapse. The Keynesian capitalism of after World War II was much more stable, much less susceptible to those kinds of deviations. Yet, ideologically, again, because of the nature of science, because of the nature of economics, and because economics today is dominated by free market ideologies, free market philosophies, we believe that the science of running our economy is a science that leads us to free market policies, and that's how we govern ourselves. And I think it's apparent that, science doesn't have all the answers. Science is a point of view in an ever-moving stream of potential knowledge. The world is too dynamic, really, for science to ever fully capture the nuances. So we need to think carefully about our ethical commitments. Now, to close out today's lecture, I wanted to do something fun here with you guys, and that is to talk about something very, very relevant to our conversation today, and that is the debate between Slavoj Žižek and Jordan Peterson, which took place on April 19th, 2019 in Toronto. So obviously, Jordan Peterson, if you are someone who's familiar with him and his work, Jordan Peterson is known as someone who defends traditional moral orders, traditional moral hierarchies. And he's famous, for example, for the idea, that we should study lobsters, because even in lobsters, there's a pecking order, right? There's a natural hierarchy, and that natural hierarchy gives the species of lobsters certain advantages. And so too, he's arguing, that humanity can draw certain advantages from the study of its own natural hierarchies and accepting those natural hierarchies. Some people are stronger than others. Some people are more beautiful maybe than others. And by trying to sort of fit or shoehorn all of humanity into this kind of like horizontalist way of living, that there's no hierarchies at all, says Jordan Peterson, we are damaging ourselves ultimately. We're lying to each other. So anyway, no surprise then that in a way Jordan Peterson opened his debate, and I would encourage people to look this debate up on YouTube. It was really, really good and worth watching. This was described as the intellectual debate of the century, and I don't know if it was that exactly, but it was a very good debate. There's a lot of people out there who are critical of it, but I personally found it very edifying. But Jordan Peterson, as I was about to say, opens his comments in the debate by saying, we have to give the devil his due. Give the devil his due. And this is not a surprising comment from Jordan Peterson. The devil in this instance was Marx, Karl Marx. And Jordan Peterson surprisingly says Karl Marx was correct, at least in one sense, and that was to diagnose the existence of hierarchy in history. Throughout history, as you know, if you've even studied a little bit of Marx, we have those who have and those who have not, those who have power, those who don't. And even in capitalism today, we have hierarchy. We have the elites and we have the rest, the 1% and the 99%. And Jordan Peterson goes even a surprising step further to concede to Marx that Marx may be correct, that what this speaks to throughout history, this long history of dichotomies between those who have power and those who don't, those who have wealth and those who don't, even in capitalism today, that this is effectively suggesting that history is a history of class struggle, which is a very Marxist thing to say, and very surprising to hear Jordan Peterson say that. But, says Jordan Peterson, it's not that different to what you see in biology, where, and I quote, he says, the creatures at the biological bottom do get dispossessed. Nevertheless, says Peterson, we can't derive from these observations the need for a political agenda of bucking the system. Marx was wrong at the end of the day to say profit is theft. Now that's actually, if you are aware of Marxism and the full sort of sweep of Marxist history, that's actually not really that Marxist thing to say. Marx did disagree that profit was theft, but there was particular reasons for that, which we can talk about another day. But what Jordan Peterson is trying to say here is that despite the limitations that capitalism places on our lives, and they can be very cruel limitations indeed, that overall the capitalist order has been very beneficial for humanity. And of course, Marx did make this argument too. In the long run, and we can, if we watch the debate, see Jordan Peterson offer a lot of data here on this. In the long run, you can see that the poor do get richer under capitalism. They get richer slowly, they get richer, however, in time, and their lives improve. And the data suggests that capitalism has historically elevated billions out of poverty. Conversely then, for Jordan Peterson, history is littered with the evidence of disasters of Marxist thinking. This suggests to him that, to go back to the topic of our debate today, efforts to change the world, good faith efforts to change the world, often ignore the unintended consequences of their actions, right? You may set out to create a Marxist utopia, but, you end up slaughtering, incarcerating millions in gulags and things like this. So this is Jordan Peterson's approach, and it's a pretty actually standard conservative argument that Jordan Peterson is putting forward here, and it's one that I think is aligned a little bit with what Maya Zafis is arguing in the chapter. The uncertainty of our desire to change the world, having us pause, having us hold back before we change the world fully, right? So we could, in a sense, leave it there, but I actually think that Zizek's response is a nice place to end for us today, thinking about Maya Zafis' comments and thinking about, of course, Jordan Peterson's comments and this kind of hesitancy that they're trying to get us to think about before we seek to change the world. Now, Zizek, for his part in this debate, does an interesting thing. He chooses not to defend Marxism. Jordan Peterson had rocked up into the debate and he'd read one of Marx's essays called The Communist Manifesto. Of course, Marx wrote much, much more than that. But Jordan Peterson had studied The Communist Manifesto, which is probably the most famous of Marx's writings, and finds all these kind of inconsistencies and problems in it. Now, Marx in The Communist Manifesto is not trying to write a rigorous, empirical, argumentative critique of capitalism or anything like this. He's trying to write a political manifesto for his time that people around him could rally to and things like this. So I think it's important to understand the political function of the Communist Manifesto and not the analytical one, although there's some analysis that we certainly shouldn't ignore. But Peterson... let me see if I can get this right here. Zizek opens his remarks by kind of agreeing with Jordan Peterson in many ways, to sort of accept the accusations from Jordan Peterson that Marxism has these historical problems to answer for, right? And in another way, though, wants to attack Jordan Peterson, or at least undermine his views about the hesitation point, right? This idea of that somehow we shouldn't change the world because we're more or less fine now, and there might be unintended consequences in the future. I think Zizek wants to kind of accuse Peterson of having a kind of a nostalgia for older orders, and maybe even a metaphysical or a poetic understanding of history that actually is kind of inconsistent with the way history works, and certainly is ignorant of the ways in which those older forms of order, even if they may have functioned well, are just not really applicable today. And if I can get my argument straight here on this, what I'm going to end up arguing to you here is that there's a direct correlation, direct connection between what Zizek's arguing and the argument put forward in the previous slide where we were talking about Nietzsche. So Zizek is unequivocal here, right? He argues in the debate that we live in modern times, and just as we were arguing in the previous slide, that God is now dead, and you cannot put the genie back in the bottle. God cannot be made alive again, right? You and I might privately agree or believe in God, but we'll never live in a world again where, in the Western world or globally even, that the principles of science are not part of the way we govern ourselves. We'll never live in a world again where, on a global basis, there is no separation between church and state. Says Zizek, we've taken the genie out of the bottle. We've been living too long under science and democracy to suddenly go back to the era before the separation of church and state, where God's will was implemented for us by a king or a queen or an emperor or something like this. So that is important, right? Because it's a major criticism and rebuttal of Jordan Peterson's nostalgia for the past. And that's great. But here's the surprise, right? This is maybe where Zizek is seen to agree with Jordan Peterson for certain reasons. Zizek's, I think, primary contribution to the debate is that communism and capitalism both failed. Capitalism fails today, communism failed then, for what are ultimately very similar reasons to the reason why the older religious orders also failed. Because all of them ipso facto, pretty much every attempt at creating order that humanity's ever undertaken have failed to separate expertise, that is to say scientific knowledge, from political power. Think about that for a second. It means that whether it's capitalism or religious order or communism, the political agenda is commanding the agenda of science. And what that means is that we're engaging always in a kind of a hypocrisy. We're pushing science into and engaging in biased or prejudicial science to suit our needs. We go back to the phrenologists that we talked about at the start of the semester and how they thought they were doing science. But actually, we know now, clearly, without any shadow of a doubt, that what they were doing was creating a legitimation, a science that legitimized, a prejudicial science that was intended to legitimize the racial order that kept them in the position that they wanted to be kept in. So that's what we mean when we're talking about the failure to separate expertise from political power. Now, this is interesting because, especially I think in today's left, we talk a lot about the need for democracy. We talk about the need to democratize the economy, to democratize production, to get it away from Wall Street, bring our government, control of our economy back from Wall Street, to inscribe it in the people, to democratize our science, etc. We don't appreciate or like the idea of experts governing us separately to our democratic will. And if you think that's, by the way, a left-wing thing, think also about Sarah Palin in the 2008 election when she was John McCain's running mate, and arguing against Obamacare on the basis of what she called death panels. These autonomous experts that Obamacare was going to set up that would decide whether you needed the surgery. We have a problem in America where hospitals at the end of our lives write blank checks to themselves on our insurance, right? This is undoubtedly an issue, right? There's no question about it. You'll spend more on healthcare in the last 2 to 3 months of your life than you will in the rest of your life put together. And this is because hospitals are ordering, MRIs and medications and all kinds of things for you to see how you're doing, when any doctor with an ounce of sense would know this patient maybe has 2 to 3 months to live. An extra MRI is going to cost 10 grand and not necessarily be any benefit for the patient, right? The idea at that point should be to give you a nice, comfortable end of your life, not to give you another 10 grand MRI. But we're hooked up on this, and the medical experts who are working in for-profit hospitals are writing checks for the hospital, and the hospitals are making tremendous profits on the strength of it. Obamacare was going to put in this panel of experts that could decide under different situations who really needs an MRI, and just to sort of try to put a cap on this expense that the free market system is heaping on our insurance companies, but also on our loved ones, because the insurance companies don't cover all the debt, by the way, so that gets passed on to the people we leave behind when we die. So Zizek is saying, whether it's the right-wing complaints about this from people like Sarah Palin or the left-wing complaints from Bernie Sanders, whatever have you, that the point is we do need independent expertise, and this is painful for us to hear, right? Because it reminds us that democracy is not just something we have. It doesn't just fall out of the sky into our lap. Democracy is something we do, and it's something we have to do every day, every week, every month in order for it to exist, right? If we just go to sleep and we live nominally in a democracy, what do you think is going to happen, right? Elites are going to just run the thing as they want to run the thing. And so this is why Zizek is sort of saying, don't dismiss the idea of the independent expert just yet, right? Not least because freedom hurts. It doesn't come to us spontaneously, and we need some kind of expert to guide us. We need some kind of expert to tell us how to orient ourselves and how to be citizens, right? It doesn't just come naturally. Zizek refers to this as a master figure to push us, and he says, awaken us to our freedom. And that's a very interesting thing to hear a left-wing guy say, because in fact it sounds an awful like, in some ways, like what Jordan Peterson has been arguing, which is that we need to kind of have someone tell us the hard truths about ourselves, right? Now, Zizek isn't quite calling for a dictatorship of experts, by the way, and he's well aware that Marx himself in his own lifetime, although in many ways sort of seen to be advocating a technocratic kind of Soviet-style way of governing humanity, Marx celebrated many democratic revolutions in his time, not least the Paris Commune of 1871, but he also argued numerous times that he thought that America and the slave revolts in America might show that the revolution that he sought could be achieved through democratic means as well as other means. So he also, Zizek, speaks at length about how the ancient Greeks would set up bodies of experts but rotate them based on a lottery. So, like if you have 1,000 experts on a topic, 10 of them on a lottery basis would be selected to be an expert panel on a thing at a certain time, right? Council of elders, what have you. And then after a year or two, they would rotate out. And so you'd have this constantly rotating group. Maybe 2 or 3 are leaving one year, 2 or 3 new ones coming in. The next year, 2 or 3 leaving, 2 or 3 more coming back in. So you constantly have this like fresh blood circulating through your panel of experts. The ancient Greeks were interesting that way. And Zizek sort of certainly then is in that sense saying, it's not like democracy has no function here. But the point, however we do this, however we embed our experts in democratic practices, they do need some kind of immunity from political pressures, be it the pressures of the masses, be it the pressures of the elites, be it the pressures of our priests. I come from Ireland. We've had a long history of priests influencing our politics, and not always for the best, I can tell you. So Zizek's great example of where and why independent experts are going to be needed moving forward for our species is to save the oceans, to save the environment, to prevent global warming. That we simply cannot rule the commons democratically. It's not possible. We need, not least for the fact that it's an incredibly complex field. Global warming is not just throwing carbon in the atmosphere and the planet warming and then it's somehow going to stop. No, it's very complex. There's redundancies and complex chains, and I have to talk about methane emission as well. And once the ice caps have melted, the methane gets released from thousands and thousands of years ago in bogs, ancient bogs in Antarctica and stuff like this. So we are going to need very complicated scientific tools and mechanisms to monitor, to regulate, and also to recover from global warming. And Zizek's just trying to get us to be honest that that's not going to be done through voting, because voters don't have the expertise. We have at some point to kind of trust, to have that leap of trust and accept scientists know more about this shit than we do, So the conclusion, a very interesting one. Jordan Peterson argues that today's left is too oriented towards radical democracy and horizontality, and of course, identity politics. He calls this cultural Marxism. Zizek, in a very telling moment in the debate, says, okay, look, you keep talking about cultural Marxism, but who are these cultural Marxists, He's like, I very well know that there are academics who are into identity politics and things like this, but Marxists, really? Jordan Peterson has an interesting answer there, but at the end of the day, he cannot answer Zizek's question, if you note. He cannot really name Marxists, and Zizek makes an excellent point at this moment where he says, like, if you look at the actual Marxists in academia today, you will find that they are really marginal figures. They are not published in mainstream journals. They are not recognized by their mainstream colleagues. They are very marginal figures indeed. So there is this interesting exchange between the two on that point, but that's not the reason we're talking about this debate today. If you're interested in that topic, go ahead and watch the debate on your own. Just search it on YouTube. But Zizek responds to Jordan Peterson's core points about radical democracy and horizontality and the left and all the rest by kind of coming to the question as an old school Marxist and says, yes, you're right. Today's left the so-called new left, the post-1968 left, is too oriented towards democracy. But the problem cannot be solved by capitalism. Because while capitalism separates authority from democracy, it re-embeds authority in the logic of the markets and the logic of the economists, which is a logic ultimately that is killing our planet. And this is what Zizek, I think, wants to get Peterson to recognize, is that the moral hierarchy that the markets, we think, produce, where, you know, if you work hard, you're going to be successful. And so therefore those who have money are those who have the moral fiber and integrity in our species, right? So we should trust them to be our leaders. And of course, we look at many of the businessmen who've been our political leaders over the years and maybe found a lot of them wanting. But Slavoj Žižek is under no illusions on this. The communism of the Soviet Union also separated expertise from political power in some ways, right, by separating it from the domination of economists, but then re-embedded it in the tyranny, if you will, of a Stalinist agenda. And we know that was also corrupt and self-serving. And while it may have done some great things, for example, in China, it elevated millions, billions, perhaps, or close to a billion, out of poverty. Nevertheless, it's perverse and paradoxical today that China is, you know, one of the most capitalist countries on the planet. So Zizek closes, and I think it's the way we should close today, by saying that if we really want to change the world, and let me put it in very stark terms, whether we're left-wing or we're right-wing or centrist, whatever we are, and you can be whatever you want to be, and I know you have a diversity of opinions as a class, but we need to cherish and make space for, ironically, given everything we've said about science this semester, but make space for experts. Otherwise, you know, we're lost, and our species doesn't have too much of a future ahead of it if we can't do this. So anyway, it's been such a pleasure, guys, having you this semester. Thank you for your time, your patience. We've had ups and downs, ins and outs, but I've really enjoyed working with you all. The next thing to look out for as we move towards the end of semester is, this is the last lecture, of course, but we have the study guide coming out soon. So be on the lookout for that. It'll be out in the coming days. And you will also have from me a little video to go along with that. And then you'll take the final exam during exam week. You have all week to take that exam, just like in the midterm. And just pick the day, pick the time that suits you, and you'll take it at home. Multiple choice exam covering the material from the second half of the course. All right, you've been great. Thanks so much. It was an honor, a privilege, and I really appreciated working with you. Thank you.